Canon versus continuity. What is canon? Canon is the total official knowledge held about a property. It is the reference for creating new canon, and as such it is defined by the legal owner of that property. We often refer to canon in both a data and a metadata sense, that is, the knowledge or lore held inside a property, such as James T. Kirk commanded the USS Enterprise, and information that describes a property that the characters wouldn't know, such as the Book of Boba Fett is part of Star Wars canon. Star Trek and, say, Doctor Who are clearly part of separate canon because their world building is contradictory and follows different rules. Whereas shows like A Town Called Eureka and Warehouse 13 cross over and are therefore part of the same canon even though they largely don't affect each other. So what is continuity? Noun: the unbroken and consistent existence or operation of something over time. In this context, I'm using it to describe a string of lore that exists within canon. A timeline, universe, dimension, reality, trouser leg. Any single strand that exists within the overall history of the property and defines the events in a preferably consistent sequence. Marvel famously have a multiverse, multiple continuities that present a different view of the same overall history and characters. From comics to film, this has offered an easy way to reboot a story when something isn't working or to explore a what-if scenario. We make the assumption, though, because it is a multiverse, that when a new continuity is started, the others still exist. They're not reset unless explicitly stated, and it is therefore possible to move between continuities within the overall canon. By contrast, Star Trek has largely stuck to one continuity. It is, and has always been, part of canon that others exist, but until 2009 none of the official properties were predominantly based in a separate continuity, and in fact I would argue that even then the original intent was to reset the continuity and replace it, rather than create a new one. How can continuity be changed then? Outside of canon. For Star Trek, only the TV shows and films have ever been considered official canon. There are a series of Trek-based books that have their own history, but other books exist outside of them, and the visual media was never constrained by anything they set down, although it could make ideas originating in the book's canon if they did use anything. TAS exists somewhere in between, but that's a debate for another time. For now, let's assume it does exist in canon and leave the continuity up for debate. Star Wars was always different. For a significant period of time, the books and other media collectively known as the Extended Universe were considered to be the official continuation of the franchise, and therefore had some responsibility, though not perfect, to keep the stories and characters true to that continuity. When Disney took over, they declared, as the new franchise owners, that the EU was no longer canon. There are good arguments for and against this approach, but it's certainly the most straightforward option for defining a new direction. A full reboot or a new adaptation of a book is another example of this, but instead of defining the removal of something from canon, it's starting an entirely separate canon while pulling from the same original source material. The success of this largely depends on the execution and the interest in the premise as a whole. Inside canon. When you want to change something from inside canon, it gets messy because you're effectively talking about altering history and all the ramifications that come with it. The obvious way is to have a time travel event. Now, this could start a long debate about quantum, parallel worlds, paradox, and the accidental killing of hypothetical grandparents, so I'll ask you to accept the premise that the method you use to travel in time makes a difference to the effect you actually have on continuity, but that it only matters if you care about both outcomes. Changing a point in time has one of two outcomes where a continuity can continue forward. A single strand of continuity changes and the previous history is erased, or it branches into two, allowing both timelines to exist simultaneously. My point is, from a storytelling perspective, it doesn't really matter if your action changed or branched the continuity, if you're only going to tell the story from one perspective going forward. Going back to the argument about the 2009 Trek film, a character goes back in time and changes history, and the implication is that the continuity has changed, and this will be the new timeline. The fans largely rejected this idea, because the original timeline is the one we care about, and you can make a compelling argument for this, on the basis that the prime timeline Spock continues to exist. The more subtle, or some might say insidious way of changing canon is to contradict it. This can work if the previous history was anecdotal and not seen by the audience themselves, or if there's enough of a gap to write a clever twist. Too often, though, the original canon is simply ignored in favour of a new narrative. Technically, this is a continuity error, but the reaction of the audience tends to depend on the context. The change in appearance of the Klingons in Star Trek between TOS and TNG was largely accepted because everyone knew budgets and effects had moved on, it was considered something of a natural upgrade, and generally people thought the new look was cool. It didn't need to be explained at the time, and Worf's "we don't talk about it" in Trials and Tribulations was enough. No further explanation was needed, wanted, or should ever have been attempted. Spotting unintentional continuity errors and debating how they could be fixed used to be a popular pastime amongst fans. In fact, discontent only really begins when it appears canon has been disregarded in a disrespectful manner. I'm sure we can all think of examples of that. Inside canon change, outside canon effect. What about when the change is so large it completely rewrites a section of canon? Could it decanonise a show? No. If you're inside continuity, any changes you make only affect that continuity. There's actually no real difference between small and large continuity errors. If something is changed without explanation, it is in fact creating a point of divergence into a new continuity, or at least showing that a split occurred at some point. You could redefine it, however. For example, it could be a dream or a simulation that didn't actually happen in the reality of that continuity, taking into account all the possible ramifications and knock-on effects of that. But it's still happening in canon. It continues to exist either in a different form or continuity somewhere in the multiverse. That story is just not continuing. Fandom-defined canon. I know, I said that canon can only be controlled by the owner of the property, and that is true from a certain point of view. We cannot, for example, individually or collectively, ban the reference of particular shows, events or characters from all future canon media. For example, Picard Season 1 and 2 are very much part of Picard Season 3 and would continue to be part of any show that follows on from it. The events can be referenced, expanded upon and used in any way the property owner sees fit. However, a fundamental truth about canon is that it only matters when someone cares about it, and therefore it's ultimately the fans that determine what will be remembered. Star Trek, Star Wars, Stargate, Doctor Who, Babylon 5, etc. all became what they were because in a relatively short space of time they inspired a dedicated, passionate fan base to care about the characters, the stories, the history. If it's subsequently deconstructed to the point of destruction, if what was special about it is lost and it ceases to be important to its fan base, who owns it no longer matters because it has inherently lost that value. When the decay has begun, dissension amongst fans actually works in the studio's favour because they can blame the failing interest on external factors rather than their own mistakes. The problem is that everyone has their own line in the sand when it comes to canon violations, and it's also hard for fans to entirely give up the hope of new stories in our favourite universes. So instead of a united fandom sending a clear message by ceasing to watch, talk about and buy bad quality output, the properties we love are suffering long and lingering deaths as they get consistently worse, while hope for something better slowly fades and people wander away, until all that is left is the name.